Hey, Demon here, and in this video tutorial I will be tackling the question, how can I replicate the look of watercolor digitally, and can you give me some tips on when to do this? This is actually a really fun one to tackle. One thing that I actually enjoy doing myself in my work is kind of replicating oil painting, so kind of tackling watercolor is something I actually never really approached before, but it's something that I enjoy, trying to do is kind of like get that visual aesthetic that traditional mediums can give us. And so as we start, it'd be, let's, kind of like pick apart like some of the major factors that kind of make watercolor kind of stand out, or at least some of the ways that people use watercolors. And some of the main things is kind of watercolor is generally kind of like painted in these big, large, swaths of color, which then have a dark edge of kind of like a darker area due to surface tension of the water kind of hitting the page and the pigments collecting around the edges. The other thing you kind of see is kind of diffusal of the pigments, so it kind of disperses, and you kind of get this grainy kind of effect in the paint. And so what we're going to try to do is, as you can see here, is the finished piece, but I'll go through and kind of talk about how I kind of achieve those aesthetics. So let's kind of go back, and we'll minimize this, and I'll bring up my sketch. So we have our sketch here, and I'm just going to start by kind of doing an underpainting of color. So I'm going to come here and grab some kind of like a purplish color I think I started off with. And I generally like to use these Adobe's natural media brushes, because you can kind of paint away, and it's it kind of gives you that kind of brushstroke stuff. But that's less important on creating this aesthetic. The most important thing is, so we kind of paint in our colors here. And I think I kind of like to just start with the kind of the shadow that is cast. So it's just kind of paint in the forms there. And yeah, it's still, it doesn't quite look like watercolor quite yet, but it was just kind of like painting in the forms. And then and kind of like one of the major things to kind of get that grainy watercolor texture feel is from actually just a photo texture. So this I pulled offline from cartographersguild.com. I believe they offer some of these textures for free to use for anyone. So either find them there, or find another free source online, or take a photo yourself. This is just a photo of a lightly washed paper with watercolor. So I like to set it to color burn. As you can see, as soon as I turn that on, it already starts to give my paint this kind of grainy watercolor look, because it's actually picking up the grains in the photo texture and applying it to my color. And you kind of see a little darker, a little better with these darker colors. So one of the key things, so after I've kind of like painted in an area of color here, I like to then lock the transparency. And what that means is, if you actually, I'll pull over my layer palette here. You see my layer here is the lock transparency is right here. Just lock that on, and what that does is you can actually then paint with a color, and it'll only affect the pixels that are actually on that layer. So what that means is I can then go, you can use that for my benefit here, and kind of imitate the kind of diffusing of the pigments of watercolor. And what that tends to do is kind of gets darker in patches and lighter in the middles of these areas. So you can kind of get this kind of watercolor effect. The other thing I think I did in the actual illustration is I also, with the transparency locked, I'll actually take a gradient. It's kind of at 50% opacity and kind of do some washes essentially on it and kind of get these nice kind of colors kind of diffusing through my piece. And yeah, and I think the last thing that I kind of did to, one of the last things I did is, so on my layer here, to kind of get that edge effect, I actually did an inner glow. But instead of setting to screen, I actually set it to multiply and kind of picked a color similar to that palette. I think kind of brought it down, maybe bring the size down a little bit. Just enough to make a noticeable difference. Now I can unlock that transparency, and let's say I want to, paint some more. Now when I paint with this natural media brush, it has a nice effect where it actually blends really nice with its, kind of like with itself. But then as soon as it hits like a dry surface, like anything that's not its layer, it actually has a nice sharp kind of paint strokey edge. So it kind of like creates this nice watercolor effect as we're painting there. Yeah, and then the last thing, the last thing I do is then set layers on top of each other. Let's get a lighter kind of wash here. And I set it to multiply to kind of get that glazing effect. Let's do a copy layer style here. Paste. So you kind of get this nice kind of like wash effect. And if that's too strong, I mean, don't feel like it always has to be this sharp line. You can kind of come in and grab my soft oil and kind of soften that a little bit. But it still has that nice watercolor effect. But yeah, so that's is at least the basic approach. And yeah, so let's go into the actual image, and I will run through that really quick. So, all right, so let's tackle this example illustration. So yeah, so I get started and just kind of start sketching up my what I like to call a mermage. So it's a mermaid plus a mage. I don't know. It's pretty good, I know. I'm probably not the first one to coin that one, but anyway, so I'm just kind of painting in my basic color shapes. So it's just kind of starting with the background there, kind of block it in, and then painting in kind of like a purpley, kind of like, kind of higher chroma, like shadow there. So I wanted to have that kind of like watercolor, like vibrant watercolor kind of feel. And like the beginning of the video, kind of just start painting in like some darker values of that purple, and then I kind of come in later and kind of lock the transparency and paint in some lighter kind of values of the same hue there to kind of try to get that kind of diffused pigment effect. Yeah, and then I kind of come in with kind of like a detail, color of like this kind of brownish color to just kind of pull in the details, but still kind of not necessarily line work, but kind of painting in kind of like, bigger swaths of color. Yeah, I kind of decided against that sword there and decided to make it a little more, I don't know, mystical or something. The sword was cool though, but it's kind of changing the. But yeah, as you can see, like all these different colors are on separate layers. None of these are actually set to multiply at the moment. I come in and do that on my last layer, kind of like the detail layer. These are, but it's still trying to get that effect that if it was a watercolor, the white of the page would be, reserved for the highest the brightest value range and whatnot. And as you saw back there, that was actually when I was experimenting with the darker edge. Yeah, so feel free to experiment with that and kind of like always pull up some reference. Like some of my favorite watercolors are by John Singer Sargent. So, feel free to Google him and kind of see how he uses, or maybe you have a favorite watercolor artist and kind of like see how they actually use the watercolors and use them. You kind of like its restrictions as use those restrictions to get these kind of nice aesthetics that we see and know and love in watercolors. Yeah, so kind of just continuing on some details here, kind of keeping everything pretty like separated shapes, high contrast of shadow and light there, which I'm enjoying, and kind of giving it, keeping the brushwork feel. So here's where I actually add in the layer that set to multiply, and this is so you can kind of get that glazing effect. Yeah, so kind of just paint it in. These shapes aren't as hard, like of line. I kind of painted them soft, kind of paint them softer, as if I was being a little more delicate with my paint. If this was a watercolor, whereas some of those like darker shadows have that nice crisp edge, which is really nice. And it kind of like, if you see in the kind of like the seaweed hair on the left there, kind of actually kind of left some of the white kind of exposed, almost like it was hard to kind of get the two colors to meet up exactly, but at the same time kind of also giving the highlight effect on the hair as well. Yeah, so just kind of fine-tuning some of the details, correcting my anatomy, and but most importantly, like you can see the kind of like the paper texture effect that the watercolor wash is kind of giving all of my colors, and I've set that to the color burn on top, and then even underneath all the colors I have it's set to normal, just to kind of give the white that kind of paper texture as well. But yeah, so I'm kind of wrapping up here, just kind of adding my finishing touches, and yeah, so hopefully I succeeded there in creating a watercolor-esque painting. But yeah, have a good one.